Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook for September 9th, 2025. Let's start off with the National Hurricane Center homepage to once again, yet another day of no activity expected in the Atlantic for the next 7 days. And we are on September 9th. We are now just a day away from the peak day of the hurricane season, climatology-wise at least. And there's absolutely nothing that is to be expected right now in the Atlantic Basin. All of the activity is still in the Eastern Pacific. We have Tropical Storm Kiko, maximum sustained winds at 45 miles per hour. This is slowly dying off and not really going to be worrying about Kiko much anymore. But there is another area back to the east here, right off the coast of Mexico, that we're going to have to watch closely. And this might be an area that could also try to develop and become our next named storm in the Pacific. And let's actually take our first satellite shot of today's video in the Pacific, and you can see quite a bit of convective activity occurring there right now. Seems like the MJO is still more favorable in the Pacific, at least in terms of where all of the rising motion is concentrated in. And as a result, that's where we are getting a lot of our Pacific activity right now. And you can see this is the area of where we're watching here. It's right off the southwest coast of Mexico and off the coast of Central America. Definitely some convective activity here, very broad and disorganized, embedded within the intertropical convergence zone here in the Pacific. Nothing organized quite yet, but we're probably going to see some organization occur here over the next several days as development occurs just off the coast of Mexico. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, let's see how things are doing. And once again, nothing in the development aspect to talk about at all whatsoever on September 9th. Quite an unusual sight. And just incredible that we are here in the peak days, not just the peak month, because September as a whole is the peak month of the hurricane season, but we are here in the peak days of the season, and there's nothing happening. There is, some convective activity occurring. We have a lot of energy still off the East Coast, and this has really been a reoccurring thing quite a bit throughout the year so far. Lots of activity off the East Coast in terms of fronts coming through, and I'm going to show you how that ties into the overall pattern in a little bit. But we have lots of activity off the East Coast, some convective activity through the Caribbean, and then we do have some waves out here, but they're just very weak. They're not potent, and they're not, consolidating and developing at all. And you do see that there's another wave coming off the coast of Africa, but they're just not, they just really don't have that oomph they need to be able to develop. But even then, it's still kind of mind-boggling that on September 9th, you would assume maybe even weaker waves that are not as strong would still have maybe enough favorability that they would try to develop, since we are in the climatology peak after all. But no, we don't. And the number one thing that plays into all of this, and this is something, and this is overall a part of a bigger pattern, which I'll show you here in the next slide by a tweet from Andy Hazelton. But the number one thing that stands out to me, look at all of the dry air we have here, especially in the mid-levels of the atmosphere in the Atlantic. And I thought that a few weeks ago we were going to get rid of it, as climatology-wise, Saharan air was starting to lift further to the north. And in general, just you would typically expect that this time of the year things would become more favorable thermodynamics-wise in the MDR. But no, still we have a lot of dry air, very, very prevalent throughout the MDR, even extending into the Caribbean here. And it's just keeping a lid on these tropical waves that they are just not able to develop at all. And again, this is a part of a much bigger overall pattern that has been occurring at least for the last several weeks. And it looks like that this will probably continue as well for at least another few more weeks. So pretty much for the foreseeable future through this month, and this is according to Andy Hazelton, And the best pattern matchup that he compares this to, and it's kind of a little bit, not very easy to take seriously because a lot of people kind of, just casually tend to throw it around whenever the Atlantic is not doing so well activity wise periodically. Everybody always mentions 2013, but Andy Hazelton says the pattern, it's not a perfect matchup, but this pattern we are in with a persistent trough off the East Coast and then wave breaking undercutting in the Atlantic does fit what happened in September of 2013. So pretty much, as I just mentioned, we have a lot of activity with troughiness and fronts off the East Coast, and because of that, it ends up resulting in troughs to break off in the Eastern Atlantic and causes what I mentioned sometimes from time to time, tropical upper tropospheric trough, which pretty much means higher shear, but especially lots of dry air being dispensed throughout the Eastern Atlantic. And he mentions that this persistent tut around 40 west has been interfering with the waves as they emerge from Africa, and the trough in the far southwestern Atlantic is preventing systems from developing further west. There may be a window in the central Atlantic, but it's a pretty narrow one. So pretty much we've been in an overall pattern somewhat similar to 2013, and that explains as to why we have all this dry air and things have really just not been coming together, despite the fact that it's September. And actually, there's another tweet that Andy Hazelton says, and this is in reaction to a tweet from Michael Lowry, where he mentions that we right now have low Caribbean wind shear and also very, very warm sea surface temperatures too, but especially the low Caribbean wind shear. So in terms of sea surface temperatures, and I've gone over that quite extensively over the last several weeks, very warm sea surface temperature anomalies. We're also heading into a La Nina, and because of that, we have low wind shear, but we have a very unfavorable, you know, troughing and ridging pattern, which is allowing for lots of dry air in the Atlantic right now. And he says that it just goes to show that even with all these favorable things that you would typically think that by now we would be having an explosive season, Andy Hazelton says, hard to believe we're on pace for one of the quietest Septembers on record with way below normal Caribbean wind shear and a top 10-ish warm MDR. Goes to show how some of the other factors like upper level temperatures, subsidence, and dry air are overwhelming the more classic factors. And as a result, again, very unusual quiet for the month of September here in the Atlantic. And as I've said before, all of the activity, at least in the meantime, is going to be focused generally in the Pacific. And that's what I'm going to go over right now because, as I mentioned before, we do have an area of interest here just off the coast of Mexico. And as you can see here on the next several days on the GFS, we do see something develop here off the coast of Mexico. Seems like it gets going around hour 48. So by Thursday, we should potentially get a development and probably a tropical depression. And then this does remain very close to the coast of Mexico, which is why I'm also talking about this because, we could potentially see impacts from rain, definitely rip currents, maybe some higher waves here crashing along the coast. But then eventually this does make a west-northwest bend away from the Mexican coast, and then this starts heading more in a westerly direction. And then we don't see any more impacts beyond then in the Pacific. But maybe, if you actually begin to look back here towards Central America, maybe starting to see a sign of things beginning to change in the Atlantic too. And this is also what I mentioned with the MJO is things are favorable right now in the Pacific. Eventually that's going to hopefully, or we think, that would, eventually begin to shift its way further east in the globe, and we'll start to see things become more favorable gradually in the Atlantic. And you can already kind of see here the signs on the GFS on the 12Z. Notice right here in the Central Caribbean, or in Central America in the far Western Caribbean, you start to notice the building of vorticity here. And it's also kind of our classic Central American gyre setup that begins to occur here over Central America. And this is typical somewhat as we head into the late season in the Atlantic. I mentioned, if you remember earlier this year, how I mentioned that that always happens in the early season. It happens earlier and later on in the season, and it kind of has to do with the fact that trade winds in both of those times tend to be a little bit more favorable and conducive for development to occur. But it looks like that pattern might begin to set up here in the next week as we head into mid-September, and maybe around then, that's when we're going to start to see the tides change potentially for development in the Atlantic, and we're just going to have to watch it here in the Caribbean. But meanwhile, even as we watch the Atlantic, looks like the number one place where all of the unfavorability is, and that's especially in the MDR where the tut is most prevalent, as I just mentioned to you, and that's where the most amount of dry air is. You notice here over the next week, not much happening, although actually very surprising. I didn't notice this earlier on. Maybe it might be around a week out from now we start to get development here in the Western Caribbean, and the GFS also seems to have some signal of things trying to get going here in the MDR. So could that be a sign of maybe the tides beginning to change and this unfavorable pattern that we are stuck in will eventually let up and we'll start to see things produce in the Atlantic? We'll see. But I can tell you, this is very unusual that we are in this quiet period in the Atlantic right now. Definitely a product of very unusually unfavorable conditions that we would typically have for the Atlantic. But especially, since the time of year we are in, the climatology of the Atlantic in September, eventually you would think that climatology would win out and we would eventually start seeing things produce. I mean, that's just what we typically see in September, especially early to mid-September, that it is, once again, that is the most active period in the Atlantic. So we'll see what happens here over the next week, and we'll see if things begin to change, especially change from this very unusual quiet period we are having right now in the Atlantic. But until then, that's all it's going to do for today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video as well with family and friends, get the word out. Also, if you know people as well that like tracking the tropics, please send this video to them, because we're going to be continuing to do these videos every single day, even as we don't have a lot to talk about. Still going to be posting these videos every single day from now all the way till the end of hurricane season. So please make sure to stay tuned for that. Enjoy the rest of your day, and as always, I'll be back with more tomorrow.